government-managed buffer zones, where are they going to go? Have you heard of sustainable communities? Sustainable development, sustainable communities is the other side of the Wildlands Project. If you don't know about sustainable communities, please go to our website and read about them. The Department of Housing and Urban Development prepared for Habitat 2 in 1996 in Istanbul the agenda for sustainability that describes in considerable detail what the communities of the future will look like. And very briefly, if you like the idea of Cabrini Green in Chicago, which is this massive housing project for people to go in and sell drugs, then you're going to love sustainable communities. Because sustainable communities has this vision of putting people into public-private partnership housing. Now, the way that is designed to work, or at least envisioned to work, the federal government will offer a grant to an NGO to build a housing project to meet the government specifications, to manage that housing project, to assure that there is equality in terms of economic standing, ethnicity, that these housing units are, the people who live there are within walking distance of their workplaces, so that you don't have to have automobiles in these sustainable communities, that transportation will be essentially by light rail, managed by a public-private partnership. You begin to see this vision of a globally managed society. And I read a book in 1992 that said something to the effect that the central organizing principle of society has to be environmental protection. In that same book, it said the internal combustion engine should be totally abolished in 25 years. Fortunately, that guy wasn't elected president, the author of that book. But that is the philosophy that is prevailing out there in our public policy. And it's happening much faster than any of us even begin to imagine. And we haven't realized the effect. We have seen little evidences here, there, and yon, and we've gotten concerned about it. You may have seen in the newspaper not long ago that the farmers in Klamath Basin at the Oregon-California border had their water turned off because environmental organizations had convinced the Fish and Wildlife Service and the Department of Interior that the suckerfish was endangered. Now, that suckerfish has been endangered for a long time, because when the Indians found them, they beat them over the head and stuck them under a stalk of corn, because that's trash fish. And whenever somebody snagged a suckerfish on a fishing pole, you sure didn't throw it back in. You got rid of it. It was endangered. It has been endangered ever since man has discovered it. But nevertheless, it was used as an excuse to implement the Endangered Species Act and thereby acquire the authority to turn off the irrigation water that actually belonged to the farmers who were promised irrigation water in perpetuity. But nevertheless, the ESA, the Endangered Species Act, took priority, and those farmers were nearly put out of business. Why? To get them off the land that was drawn on a map to be a buffer zone around the wilderness area. We see it in California. We saw it in Missouri with the nomination of the Ozark Biosphere Reserve. We see it in Florida with the Everglades Restoration Plan. We see it in the Bay of Fundy, in the Maine-Canada border. We see it in the Yukon to Yellowstone, the Y to Y project in Cascadia. We see it in the Southern California wilderness area. We see it in Barbara Boxer's wilderness plan. We are converting this country to wilderness. But what you hear about is urban sprawl. And we've got to put a growth boundary around our urban communities. What our real problem is wilderness sprawl. Back in 1964, when the first Wilderness Act was adopted, Hubert Humphrey stood on the Senate floor and he said, this legislation will provide 9 million acres of pristine wilderness, so our posterity can see what our forefathers had to conquer. That was the purpose of the Wilderness Act, at least in the minds of the Congress in 1964. But it was not the purpose of the Wilderness Society who had nurtured that bill through Congress. It was the opening of the door. And since 1964, we have converted well over 200 million acres of wilderness. And every single year, there are new bills in Congress for more wilderness. States are now buying up land to convert to wilderness, to convert to buffer zones, in the name of protecting the environment, protecting the suckerfish, protecting the spotted owl, which never did need protecting, for protecting the yellow-bellied, red-legged, liver-lipped frog in the middle of Arizona. It is an excuse to control land and land use. More than 40% of the land area in the United States is already owned by government. Virtually every square inch of the remaining land is potentially controlled by government. You know what a wetland is? Who was it that told the story? I guess it was in a private discussion last night during the reception. Somebody told the story about some guy that was driving through, I think it was Shawnee National Forest in Illinois. He couldn't make it to the next rest stop. And he was crossing his legs and he had to stop, and he got out and he felt a whole lot better when the wildlife officer came up and charged him with doing what he shouldn't be doing inside of a national forest. It was federal land. He made a wetland along the side of the road. It is amazing. We have allowed our public policy to get to the point where the federal government, through its agencies, can come into private property and say, this is a wetland, whether it is or not. And then the burden of proof falls on the landowner to prove that it is not a wetland. And guess who ultimately makes the decision? The Corps of Engineers, or the Fish and Wildlife Service, or the agency that made the declaration in the first place. That's got the cart before the horse. You put the burden of proof to prove a negative. That's wrong, people. But this is a part of the policy that is transforming our America into a nation that fits in this global society. I don't want to sound like a fatalist, because I'm not. I'm absolutely convinced that ultimately the principles of freedom shall prevail. I know that that will happen. I may not live to see it. I won't live to see it. But truth cannot be extinguished. And our great society promotes the discovery of truth, not the suppression of it. And those of you who are involved in the climate change issue know that it is the goal of the international community, those who believe in the Rousseau socialist philosophy of governance, it is their chief objective to suppress truth in order for the propaganda to prevail that supports their power. That's not the American way. And a part of the reason I am encouraged is because a number of years ago, beginning with those people who initiated the Sagebrush Rebellion, it is the people of America that won't sit idly by and accept what is happening. That same spirit of rebellion that created this nation in the first place has never died. It continues. But those of us who believe in this philosophy are busy about our individual pursuit of happiness and allow government to do its thing until government goes beyond its boundaries. And when government goes beyond its boundaries, that rebel spirit within us arises, and we do whatever is necessary to straighten government out. And we made a big step forward at the last presidential election. But it's only a beginning. We have a lot more work to do. But just as we suppressed and stopped this Federal Land Management Act in the 70s and are beginning to stir and arouse a nation to change the Endangered Species Act, the water is flowing in Klamath Basin again, organizations are springing up all over this country. And we are beginning to work together. 4 years ago, we were a part of the creation of what's called the Freedom 21 campaign. This is a group of organizations of ordinary people who come together to say that perhaps the most important thing that we can do in our lifetime is to advance the principles of freedom in the 21st century. In public policy, in education, and in our own lives. And we have been working to do that. In Florida, which was a high priority state for implementation of the Wildlands Project, who in 1992 published 3 maps of the state showing Florida how it was in 92, how it would be in 2002, and how it would be when the Wildlands Project is fully implemented. Converting Florida from 10% public ownership and 90% private ownership to 90% public ownership and 10% private ownership. The method of choice there is the Comprehensive Everglades Restoration Project or plan. You may have seen news about it where the Everglades was destroyed by the Corps of Engineers 40 years ago when we straightened out rivers and dug canals and created thousands of acres of lush farmland, and we dried up the Everglades. Now the environmental organizations have been successful in getting Congress to create a plan, $7.8 billion, to convert the Everglades back to its pre-Columbian condition where alligators and cottonmouth moccasins roam and people no longer are able to farm. There are 52 individual projects that constitute this Everglades restoration plan. And that plan is designed to restore the Everglades to the wilderness as envisioned by Dave Foreman, by Dr. Reed Noss, by the Sierra Club, and by those who want to convert our country back to wilderness. At least 20,000 homeowners, landowners, and farmers will be driven off their land.